The gang ruled through fear, bleeding the desperate dry, forcing sick patients to pay for protection they'd never get. When they turned to a small clinic, they saw nothing but easy money and a black nurse too afraid to resist. But they had chosen the wrong person. What they didn't know was that she had been forged in war, a combat nurse who had seen more violence than they could ever inflict, someone who knew how to fight and, more importantly, how to win. They mistook kindness for weakness, never realizing they had just started a fight they couldn't survive. By the time they saw their mistake, their empire would be in ruins, and fear would no longer be theirs to control. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe. The air in Ironwood always smelled of something burned, like the city itself had long been scorched and never quite recovered. The scent of charred metal, distant gasoline, and something chemical that seeped into the skin like a warning. The people had learned to live with it, just like they learned to live with the decay, the crime, the inevitable tightening of an invisible noose around their throats. Inside Solace Clinic, the smell was different. Antiseptic and old wood, the sharp sting of alcohol wipes clashing against the coppery scent of blood. Celine Dorn moved between the beds like a soldier in a war zone, quick but steady, her dark skin gleaming under the fluorescent lights as she worked. She stood out in Ironwood, not just because she was a nurse, and not just because she was new to some of the older patients who still whispered about how the clinic used to be run by their kind, meaning white hands, pale faces, people they trusted by default. No, Celine stood out because she was a black woman in a place that didn't expect black women to be the ones in charge. In Ironwood, black folks were either struggling or surviving, but never the ones pulling others out of the gutter. A nurse like Celine? That was new, and not everyone liked new. She had learned to ignore it. The stares, the skepticism, the patients who second-guessed her advice until Dr. Henshaw repeated it word for word. Those things didn't matter. What mattered was the blood under her gloves, the thread in her needle, the heartbeat she could keep going a little longer. Celine wasn't here to be liked. She was here to keep people alive. "Mrs. Holloway, I told you to be careful." Her voice was smooth, but the sharp edge of worry cut through it. The elderly woman before her sat stiffly on the exam table, her thin frame wrapped in a housecoat that had seen better days. Her face was swollen, bruises blooming along her jaw like an artist's careless brushstroke. Blood still crusted along her temple where the skin had split. Mrs. Agnes Holloway, 83 years old and stubborn as rust, gave Celine a wry, gap-toothed smile. "I was careful," Celine exhaled sharply. "Lying to your nurse? That's a sin, you know. So is putting too much faith in certain people." Celine's fingers hesitated just for a fraction of a second, then resumed cleaning the wound. She had heard that tone before. Mrs. Holloway wasn't outright nasty. She wasn't the type to spit slurs, wasn't the type to yell about people like you. She was the type to say things with a polite kind of venom, the kind that settled just beneath the skin, waiting to sting later. The type to glance at Celine's hands and then double-check that the stitches were even, as if darker skin meant unsteady fingers. Celine had dealt with worse, much worse. She dabbed an alcohol-soaked cloth along the wound and felt the way Mrs. Holloway winced but refused to make a sound. This wasn't the first time the old woman had come in like this. "I fell," Mrs. Holloway muttered. Celine gave her a long, unimpressed look. "Fell into something hard, huh?" "Slipped." Celine traced the bruising along the older woman's wrist. Circular, precise. A grip mark, not a fall. She pressed her thumb against the discoloration just slightly, feeling the way Mrs. Holloway's muscles tensed. A careful injury, not a careless one. Celine didn't press, not yet. Instead, she let the silence stretch before she spoke again, her voice even. "Where?" A pause. "Too long. The steps." "Mrs. Holloway said finally." Celine nodded slowly, but something sat heavy in her stomach. There was no hesitation in truth, only in lies. Mrs. Holloway must have noticed the way Celine's lips pressed into a thin line because she sniffed and shook her head. "Oh, don't go making that face, girl. Some things just happen. Some of us just ain't lucky." Celine rolled the gauze a little tighter around her arm than necessary, making the old woman suck in a sharp breath. "You're not unlucky, Mrs. Holloway," she murmured. "Somebody put their hands on you." The room went still. A beat. And then Mrs. Holloway made a sound in her throat. Not a laugh. Not agreement. Just something close to inevitability. "You try to take care of people, Celine, but you can't save everyone." Celine studied her for a long moment, that unease curling deeper in her ribs. "I know," she said. She just wasn't sure who needed saving yet. The bruise on Mrs. Holloway's jaw sat heavy in Celine's mind, lingering even as she tried to push it aside, convincing herself that not every injury carried a hidden story. The clinic was moving at its usual pace. Too fast, never enough hands, always someone needing more help than they were going to get. The waiting room had been overflowing since morning, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic, and the kind of exhaustion that came from people who had learned long ago that suffering was just another part of their lives. Still, between the pulse readings, the whispered reassurances, the sutures, and the medications, Celine started noticing things she couldn't ignore. A man who cradled his ribs a little too carefully, his fingers pressing against his side as if he feared something inside him had already cracked. A woman who winced at the touch of a blood pressure cuff, her forearm already mottled with bruises beneath the sleeves of her sweater. A teenage boy who sat stiffly in his chair, his right eye swelling shut, his gaze cast downward, as if looking at anyone too long might invite something worse. It wasn't unusual for patients to come in with injuries, not in a place like Ironwood where life itself could be just as damaging as disease. But today, there were too many bruises, too many injuries that looked too deliberate, too many nervous glances between patients who refused to make eye contact with her, with the staff, with anyone who might ask questions. She watched them carefully, listening as they all gave the same quiet, dismissive explanations. "I slipped on the stairs. I wasn't paying attention. I walked into something. It's nothing, really. No, I don't need a report filed. No, I don't need help. No, no, no." And it wasn't just the words. It was the way they said them, the way their hands tightened in their laps, the way their voices softened when they should have been louder, the way they looked at her like she was someone who might help if only help was an option. By the time the sun dipped below the rooftops, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement outside, Celine had seen enough. The last few patients had cleared out, the clinic falling into the kind of stillness that only came after a long day. And yet, the tension beneath her ribs had only grown heavier. She was locking up when she noticed the last patient lingering by the door, an older man with a slight tremor in his hands, his expression tight in that way that came from someone weighing whether or not to ask for something they weren't sure they could have. Celine studied him for a moment before she spoke, her voice steady, the way it always was when she sensed someone needed reassurance more than a diagnosis. "You need anything else, Mr. Kessler?" The man hesitated, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, as if debating whether to speak. Finally, after a pause that stretched just a second too long, he cleared his throat. "Just heading home," he murmured, voice rough, a forced casualness behind it that didn't quite land. "Figured I'd wait until the streets got a little quieter." Celine didn't move right away, watching the way his fingers twitched slightly at his side, the way he looked past her instead of at her. "Which way you headed?" "Couple blocks south," he answered. "Not far." Ironwood wasn't the kind of place where people admitted they were afraid, not openly, not in ways that could be used against them later. But this was the closest thing to a request for help as she was going to get. Celine nodded once, stepping away from the clinic doors, the key still in her hand. "Come on, I'll walk with you." The relief in Mr. Kessler's expression was brief, but it was there. He didn't thank her, didn't say much of anything as they started down the street, but he didn't have to. The city was different at night, the cracks in its foundation more pronounced, the darkness pressing into the spaces between streetlights, stretching into alleyways where figures shifted just out of view. The sound of a bottle breaking somewhere in the distance, the dull thump of music pulsing from a car idling at a corner, the occasional burst of laughter sharp enough to cut through the air. They walked in silence, moving past the liquor store with its neon open sign buzzing weakly in the window, past the alley where cigarette embers flared and faded in the hands of men who never seemed to go home, past the laundromat where a woman sat behind the counter, staring blankly at a television playing something no one was really watching. And then, as they neared the next block, Celine saw them. The thorn serpents weren't hard to spot. There were 3 of them, standing just off the curb where the glow of a street lamp barely reached. One leaned lazily against a metal railing, cigarette dangling between his fingers, his attention flickering between the people passing by and whatever conversation was happening in front of him. Another was speaking to a man who stood rigid, hands clutched tightly around the handles of his wheelchair, his expression tight, unreadable. The third had his back to Celine, but she could see the tension in the way he stood, the way his body language screamed control. Mr. Kessler stiffened beside her, his steps faltering, his breath catching just slightly before he forced himself to keep walking. Celine recognized the man in the wheelchair immediately. Henry Vargas had been coming to the clinic for months now, an ex-con who had lost the use of his legs in an accident long after he'd done his time. A man who tried to keep his head down, who never asked for anything he hadn't earned, who always paid his bills in cash and never took favors. And right now, he was being shaken down. Celine didn't stop walking, but her pace slowed, her gaze flickering over the scene as she took in the details. The subtle shift of the man closest to Henry, the way his hand dipped toward his pocket, the way Henry's jaw locked like he was forcing himself not to react. There was no shouting, no obvious aggression, nothing loud or messy, just quiet, calculated pressure, the kind that let people know what was expected of them without needing to spell it out. Celine inhaled deeply through her nose, keeping her expression neutral, her posture loose, even as every muscle in her body tensed. She wasn't reckless, wasn't the kind of person who went looking for a fight without knowing exactly how it was going to end. But this was different. She might not have known exactly what had been happening to her patients, but now, watching the way Henry sat stone still in his chair, watching the way Mr. Kessler averted his gaze as they walked past, she knew enough. Knew that whatever was happening had already dug itself deep into ironwood, had already started bleeding through the cracks, had already taken hold of the people who could least afford to fight back. She could keep walking. She could keep pretending she hadn't seen anything. Or, Celine exhaled slowly, her fingers flexing once at her sides before curling into her palms. She didn't need to finish the thought. She already knew what she was going to do. The streetlights in Ironwood flickered inconsistently, casting long, wavering shadows across the cracked pavement. But the 3 men standing near the curb didn't need the light to see who was passing. They had already clocked Celine the moment she turned the corner with Kessler at her side, their eyes flicking toward her with the casual awareness of men who were used to knowing everything happening on their turf. The one standing closest to Henry Vargas smirked at something his friend said, shaking his head before rolling his shoulders, the movement slow and deliberate, as if stretching before a fight that had already been decided. The arrogance was easy to see, thick in the way they stood, in the way they barely acknowledged the older man in the wheelchair, treating him like an inconvenience rather than a person. Celine had been around men like them before. She knew exactly how they thought. They wouldn't look at her as a threat. Not now, not yet. Not a black woman in scrubs, not someone they saw as nothing more than another tired nurse getting off a shift. And that was exactly why they weren't ready for what was coming. Celine adjusted the strap of her bag as she slowed her steps, her gaze scanning the street, her posture loose but deliberate, giving no indication of tension. Kessler kept walking a few paces ahead, his body tight, his breathing shallow, but she could see the way his shoulders shifted slightly. An unspoken question. She didn't answer, not with words. Instead, she veered just slightly, cutting across the sidewalk, her movements smooth, unhurried, as if she were just another passerby taking the long way home. But instead of crossing the street, instead of walking past the scene like she hadn't noticed, she stopped just before the curb, her gaze settling on Henry Vargas. She had treated Henry before. She had seen what pride looked like when it was held together with barely stitched resolve, and right now he was cracking at the seams. "You good, Henry?" Her voice was calm, level, just another quiet conversation on the street. The man closest to Henry turned slightly, his stance adjusting just enough to acknowledge her, though there was nothing in his body language that suggested he was concerned by her presence. He was younger than she expected up close, barely in his 20s, his face smooth, but his eyes sharp in a way that said he had learned quickly what it took to survive in Ironwood. "Didn't realize we had a neighborhood watch now," he murmured, the smirk never leaving his face as he took a lazy step forward, his gaze raking over her scrubs before settling on her face. "Or is this just charity work?" Selene ignored him, keeping her eyes on Henry, waiting for the older man to answer, to say anything at all. But he didn't. He just kept staring straight ahead, his jaw locked tight, his knuckles bone white against the arms of his chair. One of the other men, the one leaning against the railing with the cigarette still dangling from his fingers, exhaled sharply before shaking his head, his laugh low and full of something ugly. "Man, come on. You really trying to be a hero right now?" Selene tilted her head slightly, finally shifting her gaze to them. "I'm just checking on my patient," she said simply, her voice calm but firm. The first guy grinned, his teeth flashing against the dim light. "Patient? Damn, you work overtime or something? Maybe you should be minding your own business instead of sticking your nose in places it don't belong." Selene let out a slow breath, her weight shifting slightly, barely enough to be noticeable. "Maybe you should let him go," she said evenly. For a moment, the three men were quiet. And then the one in front of her shook his head, the grin widening, his body language loose, casual, like a predator playing with its food. "Man, listen to this. She really thinks she's got a say in this." He turned slightly toward the others, his voice exaggerated. "You hear that? This nurse?" He dragged the word out like an insult, letting it settle between them. "She thinks she can tell us what to do." The cigarette smoker exhaled, his amusement apparent. "Ain't that something? What you gonna do, sweetheart? Give us a checkup? You got a stethoscope in that bag?" Selene could feel the tension growing, but she didn't move, didn't react to the bait, because she knew exactly what they were doing. They weren't worried, not even a little. They thought they had already won. The first man, the leader, or at least the one most eager to play the role, stepped closer, his height forcing her to look up slightly, though her posture never shifted. "Maybe you should get out of here before someone gets hurt," he murmured, the false sympathy in his voice barely masking the threat beneath. "I get it. You want to help people, right? That's real sweet, real noble. But this," he gestured vaguely toward Henry, still seated, still silent, "ain't got nothing to do with you. So how about you walk away, huh? Maybe we forget this ever happened." Selene inhaled slowly, her fingers flexing just once against the strap of her bag, before she exhaled again, controlled, measured. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. The leader sighed, shaking his head like she was disappointing him, like this was just another hassle in his night that needed to be handled. "All right then," he muttered, rolling his shoulders before taking another step forward, closing the distance between them. "I tried." The movement was fast, faster than most people would have expected from someone his size. But Selene wasn't most people. She saw the shift in his weight before his arm even moved, caught the subtle twitch in his shoulder just before he reached out, his fingers aiming for her collar, for her throat, for anything he could grab. But he never made contact. Selene moved first. She caught his wrist before it could close around her shirt, twisting it sharply to the side, forcing his arm into an unnatural angle, her grip tightening with surgical precision. Before he could even process the pain, she shifted her weight and drove her elbow into the center of his chest, her strike landing with enough force to send him stumbling back a step. The cigarette smoker barely had time to react before Selene pivoted, her next strike already in motion. She moved like a professional, efficient, ruthless, unhesitating. A sharp jab to the ribs, a hook to the jaw, the kind of hits designed to disable, not just hurt. The leader barely managed to recover before lunging forward again, his face twisted with something between rage and disbelief. But Selene was already anticipating the movement, already adjusting her stance to meet him. She had spent years learning how to fight in conditions far worse than this, had trained for scenarios where hesitation meant death, where survival depended on knowing how to dismantle an opponent before they had the chance to do the same to you. And right now, these men, they had no idea who they had just picked a fight with. The first man hit the ground hard, his balance thrown by a perfectly executed takedown. But before she could shift her attention to the others, she felt movement at her back. The cigarette smoker was coming for her. The moment Selene twisted the leader's wrist and sent him sprawling onto the pavement, the air shifted, the easy arrogance that had been so thick in the air shattering in an instant. The other two weren't laughing anymore, their smug expressions melting into something sharper, something meaner, something that said they had just realized their mistake. But realization wasn't hesitation. The cigarette smoker moved first. He came at her fast, lunging with an open hand, trying to grab her, trying to overwhelm her with size and weight, maybe hoping that if he got his hands on her, he could throw her down, end this before it really started. But Selene didn't let people get their hands on her. She sidestepped just as his fingers grazed the fabric of her scrubs, pivoting sharply before slamming the heel of her palm into the side of his head. He stumbled, his balance thrown off for just a second. But she didn't give him a chance to recover. She pressed forward, hooking her foot behind his knee, and sweeping his legs out from under him in a single, fluid motion. He hit the ground hard, his breath rushing out in a sharp grunt. But before she could follow up, before she could make sure he stayed down, pain exploded against her ribs. Selene barely had time to react before she felt the second hit. A sharp, brutal kick slamming into her stomach, sending her stumbling back a step, air torn from her lungs. The third man, the quiet one, the one who had been watching, waiting, had finally decided to move. And he was fast. Before she could fully recover, he closed the distance between them, his fists already swinging. Selene barely managed to raise her arms in time to absorb the impact, feeling the shock of it vibrate through her bones as his knuckles slammed into her forearms. This one knew how to fight. He wasn't just throwing wild punches, wasn't flailing like someone who relied on brute strength alone. His hits were controlled, strategic, his stance solid, the kind of fighter who had been in enough brawls to know how to break someone down piece by piece. Selene adjusted quickly, her body moving on instinct, blocking, stepping back, repositioning, trying to regain control. But then the leader was back on his feet, and now it was 3 against 1. The leader, his face twisted in fury, lunged forward again, swinging wild, uncoordinated but furious, trying to make her pay for knocking him down in front of his men. Selene ducked just in time to avoid the blow, but before she could counter, a second set of hands grabbed at her from behind. The cigarette smoker, already recovered, already trying to wrap his arms around her, pin her down. Selene reacted instantly. She slammed her heel down on his foot, hard enough to hear the sharp grunt of pain that followed, then threw her head back, cracking the back of her skull against his nose. His grip loosened just enough, just for a second, and that was all she needed. She twisted free, turning just as he staggered, blood dripping from his nose, his expression shifting from shock to rage. "You!" His voice was raw with fury, his lip curled, his hands already curling into fists. But Selene didn't give him the chance to finish. She drove her knee up into his stomach, knocking the wind out of him, before snapping her elbow across his temple. His body crumpled, knees buckling as he dropped onto the pavement, barely conscious before he hit the ground. One down, but there was no time to celebrate. The quiet one was already moving, already capitalizing on her split-second distraction. His fist drove forward, aiming for her ribs again, and this time he landed the hit. Pain flared sharp and immediate, radiating outward. But Celine gritted her teeth and absorbed the blow, twisting with it instead of against it, using the momentum to turn and drive her elbow into his jaw. His head snapped to the side, but he barely stumbled, shaking it off too quickly. This one was tough. She could feel it, the difference in the way he took the hit, the way his feet stayed planted, the way his eyes stayed locked on hers, calculating, measuring, already adjusting. Celine barely had time to shift back into her stance before she felt something grab at her leg. The leader, back again, snarling as he yanked at her ankle, trying to take her down. She stumbled, but she didn't fall. Instead, she let him pull just enough to give him the illusion of control, just enough to trick him into thinking he had the upper hand. And then she drove the sharp edge of her foot into his chest, kicking him so hard he hit the pavement with a breathless, choking sound. The quiet one was already stepping forward, his arms raised, his weight shifting, going for the kill. Celine took a slow breath, her body coiled, ready. The leader struggled to catch his breath, his chest heaving as he pressed a hand against the pavement, trying to steady himself. The sharp edge of disbelief flickered across his face, his mind working to process how he had lost control so completely. His fingers curled weakly, his entire body tensed as if bracing for another attack. But Celine wasn't moving. Not yet. A few feet away, the cigarette smoker groaned, blood still dripping from his nose, his hand shaking as he wiped it against his sleeve. He shifted, struggling to sit up, his movements slow and uneven, the pain making it clear that whatever had happened to him wasn't something he would be shaking off anytime soon. His dazed expression carried something heavier than just physical hurt. Humiliation. The quiet one, the fighter, was still watching her. He hadn't tried to get up, hadn't said a word, but there was something calculating in his stare, something cold and steady that told her he had already decided this wasn't over. He wasn't like the others. His pride wasn't loud, wasn't fragile, wasn't something that shattered the moment he hit the pavement. He was the kind of man who would sit with this, let it simmer, let it turn into something else. Celine remained still, her breath controlled, the ache in her ribs a dull but constant reminder that she hadn't walked away untouched. The silence between them stretched, heavy, and weighted, pressing down on the three men like a lesson they hadn't expected to be taught. They had made a mistake. They had underestimated her. And now, they knew it. The leader, still gasping slightly, finally found his voice, though it came out rough, strained, almost unsure. "Who the hell are you?" The words weren't defiant, weren't an attempt to reclaim what had already been lost. It was a question asked by a man who had just had his world realigned, who had stepped into something certain of his power, and had been forced to realize, too late, that power wasn't something given, it was something earned. Celine exhaled, rolling out her shoulders, shaking the last bit of tension from her muscles as she took a slow step forward, watching as the leader flinched just slightly, his body betraying him. She could feel the others watching her, waiting for what came next, waiting for the moment she would drive the final nail into the coffin of their confidence. "Just a nurse," she said, her voice calm, measured, letting the words sink in, letting them understand what that meant, letting them sit with the knowledge that they had just been beaten by someone they never even considered a threat. The leader didn't say anything. He didn't argue, didn't throw out another insult, didn't try to salvage the last scraps of his pride. He just sat there, breathing heavy, knowing. Celine shifted her gaze toward Henry, still seated in his wheelchair, still gripping the armrests, his fingers no longer clenched, his body no longer carrying the same tension that had been there just minutes ago. He was watching her, but differently now, not like someone waiting for trouble to pass, but like someone who had just witnessed something he never expected to see. "Let's go," she said, her voice firm, leaving no room for hesitation. Henry didn't wait, didn't look back, didn't glance at the men still sprawled across the pavement. He just adjusted his grip and started moving, rolling himself forward with a quiet ease, as if the weight of something had been lifted. Celine followed, never turning her back completely, keeping them in the corner of her vision until they were far enough down the block that the city swallowed them again. The neon hum of the liquor store sign flickered across the sidewalk, the distant sound of traffic and muffled voices replacing the silence they had left behind. Henry finally broke the quiet, his voice rough but edged with something close to amusement. "I'd say they already got a problem." Celine inhaled deeply, letting the pain settle, letting the reality of the night sink in. The fight might have been over, but she already knew the truth. Men like that never let a loss sit for long. She could feel it before she even said the words. Feel the weight of what was coming. Feel the way this was only the start of something bigger. "Yeah," she murmured, her eyes set on the road ahead, knowing that tonight had only been the beginning. And it's only gonna get worse. The silence in Ironwood never lasted long. The city breathed in tension and exhaled violence, its streets always humming with something beneath the surface. A quiet promise that nothing ever stayed buried. Celine knew better than to think she had left the fight behind, even as she walked Henry the rest of the way home, even as she checked the bruises on his arms under the dim light of his front porch, even as she listened to him grumble about how he didn't need looking after. He might have been too proud to admit it, but she could see the gratitude buried beneath the rough edges of his voice, the way he nodded once before rolling himself inside, as if that single gesture was enough to say everything he wouldn't. Celine didn't linger. She turned back toward the street, moving with quiet purpose, her ribs still aching from the fight. The sharp pull of every breath, a reminder that she hadn't walked away unscathed. She had fought harder battles before, had taken worse hits, but she had also learned to listen to her body, to recognize the difference between pain that would fade and pain that meant something was broken. This was manageable. Still, she kept her pace steady, her movements careful, her senses heightened in the way they always were after a fight, after adrenaline had left its mark but hadn't quite faded. She didn't expect them to come back for her tonight. Not so soon after what had happened, not when they had left with their tails tucked between their legs, but she knew they would come eventually. Men like that never let things go. The walk back to her apartment was quiet, the weight of the city pressing against her like it always did, the glow of streetlights flickering against the pavement, the occasional burst of laughter, or the distant sound of an argument filtering through the alleyways. Ironwood had always been like this, always teetering on the edge of something worse. But tonight, there was a shift in the air, something unspoken, something waiting. By the time she reached her building, she had already checked the street twice, already scanned the corners, already taken note of the unfamiliar car parked a block away with its engine running just a little too long. She didn't break her stride, didn't react, just made a mental note of the details. The tinted windows, the dent on the rear bumper, the way the driver never turned his head, but sat unnaturally still. She took the stairs instead of the elevator. A habit more than anything. Something ingrained in her after years of knowing that being trapped in a confined space was never a good idea. The apartment was dark when she stepped inside, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound greeting her. She locked the door behind her, securing the deadbolt. But even as she moved through the familiar space, something sat heavy in her ribs. Something that wasn't just from the fight. She wasn't wrong about them coming back for her. She just hadn't expected them to start this fast. Her phone buzzed from the kitchen counter, the screen lighting up in the darkness. She moved toward it, picking it up, her breath steady even as her eyes flicked to the message that had just come through. Unknown number, Hope you didn't think that was the end of it. You messed up, nurse. You should have stayed in your lane." Celine let the words settle, her grip tightening just slightly around the phone, her heartbeat slow and deliberate. She had been expecting this, had known it was coming the moment she had walked away from those three men and left them humiliated in the street. But what she hadn't expected, what told her just how much of a problem she had now, was the fact that this wasn't just bravado, wasn't just posturing. This was a warning, and it wasn't just coming from the men she had put down tonight. The thorn serpents had taken notice. The next morning, the clinic was busier than usual. The waiting room already full by the time Celine arrived, the low murmur of conversation filtering through the halls, the steady beeping of monitors in the background. The smell of antiseptic and old wood filled the air, a familiar contrast to the sharp scent of coffee lingering near the reception desk, where Jay Moreau stood, flipping through a patient file with an expression that told Celine it was going to be one of those days. She hadn't even made it past the front desk when she heard his voice. "You've been busy?" Celine sighed before turning to face Detective Callum Dorn, a man who had spent the better part of the last decade trying, and failing, to rid Ironwood of the thorn serpents. He stood near the entrance, arms crossed over his broad chest, his sharp eyes scanning her with the kind of scrutiny only a man like him could manage. He looked the same as always, worn but steady, his dark blazer rumpled over a dress shirt that had seen better days, his badge clipped to his belt like an afterthought. Celine met his gaze evenly, knowing exactly why he was here. "Morning, Callum." "Morning, Celine," he replied, voice steady but edged with something harder, something that meant this wasn't just a casual visit. "We need to talk." She gestured toward the back, leading him into Dr. Corwin Henshaw's office, the space cluttered with papers and medical supply lists, the scent of old books and coffee lingering in the air. Dr. Henshaw, a man who had dedicated his entire life to keeping Solace Clinic running despite every obstacle Ironwood threw at him, had already left for the day, but his presence was everywhere. His jacket draped over the chair, his worn-out medical journals stacked against the wall, his old-fashioned sense of order buried under the chaos of a clinic that never stopped moving. Callum shut the door behind them, crossing his arms again as he leaned against the desk. "I heard about what happened last night," he said, voice even but sharp. "3 serpents, taken down by a nurse. And not just any nurse." "You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Celine didn't flinch. "Sounds like they picked the wrong fight." Callum exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face, as if he already knew this conversation was going to be a waste of time. "I know it was you, Celine. I know exactly what you did. And I know exactly how this is going to play out. You're overreacting." "No. You're underreacting." His eyes locked onto hers, hard, unrelenting. "These guys don't take losses lightly. You humiliated them. You think they're just gonna let that slide?" Celine said nothing. Callum took a step forward. "Back off before this gets worse." She held his gaze for a long moment, something unreadable passing between them, something tangled in the years they had known each other, in the history they never talked about. "I'll handle it," she said finally. Callum clenched his jaw. "That's exactly what I'm afraid of." That night, the retaliation came. The first warning was the sound of breaking glass, sharp and unmistakable, followed by the roar of flames swallowing oxygen as a Molotov cocktail sailed through the front window of Solace Clinic. By the time Celine arrived, firefighters were already at work, their hoses drenching the smoldering remains of the waiting room. Dr. Henshaw stood outside, his face carved with exhaustion, his hands shaking at his sides. He turned the moment he saw her, his voice tight with frustration. "This has to stop." Celine didn't answer. Henshaw took a slow step closer, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "You need to back off, Celine. We can't afford to fight them." Celine clenched her jaw, her fists tightening at her sides, the glow of dying embers reflecting in her eyes. "I'm not backing off," she said. Henshaw let out a breath, shaking his head. "Then you're going to get yourself killed." Selene didn't flinch. Not before I make them pay for this. The smell of smoke still lingered in the air the next morning, clinging to the clinic walls, settling into the fabric of the waiting room chairs, weaving itself into every surface like an unshakable ghost of what had happened the night before. Clinic. The one place in Ironwood that had always stood its ground, that had never turned its back on the people who needed it, now bore the scars of war. Blackened window frames, shattered glass crunching beneath cautious footsteps, a scorched reception desk that had barely survived the IB blaze. They had come in the night, under the cover of shadows, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. The fire had spread fast, fueled by the broken remnants of the Molotov cocktail that had shattered against the floor, its flames eating through years of history, of hard work, of resilience, before the firefighters had finally managed to contain it. Selene stood in the center of it all, her arms crossed, her ribs still sore, the weight of everything pressing down on her chest. They didn't just send a message, Dr. Corwin Henshaw said, his voice quiet but strained as he ran a weary hand over his face, his normally composed expression lined with something dangerously close to defeat. They made sure we heard them loud and clear. Selene didn't look at him right away, her gaze fixed on the damage, her jaw clenched so tightly it ached. She had expected retaliation. She just hadn't expected them to go after the clinic so soon. "This was meant for me," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. Henshaw sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose, his exhaustion plain as he stepped closer. "That doesn't make it better." His voice was firm, the same calm authority he used when breaking bad news to patients, when trying to make them understand the weight of a situation they didn't want to accept. "This isn't just about you, Selene. These people depend on this place. They come here because they have nowhere else to go. And now," he gestured around the ruined room, "the damage irreversible without serious repairs. Now they have nothing." Selene finally turned to him, her expression unreadable. But the fire in her eyes had nothing to do with the one that had burned through the clinic. "That's exactly why I'm not backing down." Henshaw's jaw tightened. "You think you can fight them alone?" "I don't think," she said, her voice unwavering. "I know." Henshaw exhaled sharply, shaking his head, his frustration finally breaking through. "This isn't a battlefield, Selene. This isn't some war zone where you can take out the enemy and go home when the job's done. These people don't care about honor, they don't care about rules, and they sure as hell don't care about you." Selene's lips pressed together, her patience wearing thin. "They cared enough to burn this place down." "That's exactly my point." Henshaw's voice lowered, more tired than angry now, like a man who had spent too many years watching the people around him destroy themselves for something they couldn't win. "They're not just going to stop. You push. They push harder, and the next time, it won't be an empty clinic in the middle of the night. The next time, people are going to get hurt." Selene held his gaze, something unreadable flickering behind her eyes. "They already are," she said. The silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of everything neither of them was willing to say. Finally, Henshaw let out a slow breath, dragging a hand down his face. "You want to fight them? Fine, but don't pretend this is just about them. You're not just doing this because of what they did to the clinic." His eyes sharpened, his voice quiet but knowing. "You're doing this because of who you are." Selene didn't answer. She didn't have to. She turned, stepping over broken glass, moving toward the door, already knowing exactly what she needed to do next. The thorn serpents had drawn first blood, but Selene wasn't about to let them dictate the rules of engagement. The fight was no longer about Henry Vargas or Mrs. Holloway, or the gang members who had underestimated her in the street. This wasn't just about a few bruises, a few threats, a few broken bones. This was about control. And Selene knew the kind of men who ran the Serpents, knew that if they were willing to burn down the one place that had never been a threat to them, then they had already decided that Ironwood belonged to them. She had seen men like them before, on battlefields where warlords ruled with iron fists, where fear was the only currency that mattered, and she had taken those men apart, piece by piece. The serpents thought they were untouchable. They were about to learn otherwise. She started with reconnaissance. The serpents ran their operations in a way that was both predictable and calculated. A mix of old-school street power and careful business structuring that allowed them to avoid the kind of attention that would bring real heat down on them. Their lower ranks did the dirty work: shakedowns, collections, intimidation. But the real power was in the hands of a few men, the ones who never got their hands dirty. Celine needed names, and she knew exactly where to get them. The Ironwood Club wasn't the kind of place most people walked into unless they had business to handle. Tinted windows, high-priced drinks, security that knew exactly who to let in and who to throw out. The serpents didn't own it outright, but they had their hands in its pockets deep enough to make it function like their own private headquarters. Celine had dressed for the occasion. Black jeans, leather jacket, hair pulled back in a way that said she wasn't here to play games. The bruises on her ribs ached with every step, but she welcomed the discomfort. It kept her sharp. She spotted her target the moment she stepped inside. Aaron "Brick" Calloway wasn't high-ranking, but he was important. He handled a lot of the serpent's logistics: money movement, supply lines, communication between the guys on the street and the ones pulling the strings. He wasn't untouchable, but he was valuable. Celine moved toward him, slipping into the seat across from him before he had a chance to react. Brick blinked at her, his thick fingers pausing around the rim of his glass, his expression caught somewhere between amusement and confusion. "Well, damn," he muttered, shaking his head as he leaned back. "Didn't think I'd see you in here." Selena smiled, slow and deliberate. "That makes two of us." Brick chuckled, taking a sip of his drink, studying her like he was trying to figure out what the game was. "So, what's this about? You finally coming around? Figured you'd stick to that whole helping people thing." Celine tilted her head slightly, her voice steady. "I need names." Brick's smirk barely faltered, but she saw the flicker of something behind his eyes. Celine leaned in, lowering her voice. "The serpents went after my clinic. That was a mistake." She tapped a finger lightly against the table, letting the silence stretch. "You don't want to be on the wrong side of this." Brick exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "You got no idea what you're stepping into, nurse." Celine smiled again, but this time there was nothing friendly about it. "Neither do they." Celine had always believed in precision. Chaos was reckless, emotional, something that got people killed. War, real war, was about control, about knowing when to strike and when to wait, about understanding that every move had consequence and that the only way to win was to be 10 steps ahead of the enemy. The thorn serpents were many things: violent, ruthless, arrogant. But they weren't careful. They moved like they owned Ironwood, like no one could touch them, like their power was so deeply embedded in the city's bones that no one would ever challenge them. But that arrogance was exactly why they could be dismantled. Celine had spent the last 2 nights studying them, watching their movements, learning the patterns of their collections, the way they sent different men to different neighborhoods at the same times each week, the way their cash flow moved up the chain with military-like precision. They ran their racket like a well-oiled machine. Extortion disguised as protection, forcing the weak and the desperate to pay for security that never truly existed. She knew she couldn't take down the entire operation in one move, but she could break something vital. She had spent hours tracking the cash collectors, the men who went door to door shaking down the vulnerable, the ones who funneled money upward to the real power players. The system was too big to cut off completely, but if she took out one of their key collectors, it would create a ripple effect. Delays, confusion, missing money that would set off a chain reaction of distrust. The serpent's leaders wouldn't tolerate mistakes. And that was exactly what she needed. The cash pickup on the east side of Ironwood was clockwork. Every Tuesday and Friday night, just after 9, always the same pattern. A black sedan would pull up, a runner would hop out, and in less than 10 minutes, the entire block would be emptied of its money. No one fought back. No one refused. No one risked what would happen if they did. Celine waited in the shadows, concealed in the alley between a boarded-up laundromat and a corner store that had long since given up trying to keep its windows intact. She had chosen her spot carefully, close enough to act, but far enough to avoid being spotted too early. Her breathing was slow, controlled, her body loose but ready. Right on time, the black sedan pulled up to the curb. Headlights dimmed. She recognized the man who stepped out. Reese Landry, one of Tide's trusted men, a collector who had been running the streets for years, his reputation built on the bones of those who had dared to short him. He wasn't the biggest or the strongest, but he was fast, smart, a man who never worked alone. Celine scanned the street. Two more men waited in the car. One was in the driver's seat, the other sitting shotgun, his head on a swivel, watching the street like a hawk. They weren't sloppy. This wasn't an easy hit. She flexed her fingers, steadying herself. She had no intention of making it easy. Reese moved through the block with confidence, knocking on doors, speaking in low, measured tones that didn't need to be loud to be effective. People didn't argue. They paid, quickly, hands shaking as they passed over cash, fear woven into every movement. Celine watched, waiting, measuring the timing. She needed to isolate him. As he reached the last house, she moved. The moment he turned from the door, stuffing the last wad of cash into his jacket, she struck. Celine moved fast, her steps silent, her hands precise. She grabbed his arm from behind, twisting sharply, forcing his wrist into an unnatural angle, dislocating it with a brutal snap before he could even react. The muffled grunt of pain barely had time to leave his throat before she swept his legs, sending him crashing onto the pavement. The car doors flew open. The driver and the other guard were already moving, but Celine had calculated for this. Before they could react, she had Reese's gun in her hand, yanking it from his belt, leveling it at the oncoming men. "Don't!" she warned, her voice calm, unwavering. They hesitated. She had them. She could see the conflict in their eyes. Tide's men didn't scare easily, but they weren't used to this. They weren't used to someone who knew what they were doing, someone who wasn't afraid of them. Reese groaned on the ground, his breath uneven, his dislocated arm limp at his side. Celine stared them down, her grip steady. "This money," she said, nodding toward the wad of cash still tucked in Reese's coat. "It doesn't belong to you anymore." The driver's jaw clenched, his fingers twitching like he was weighing the risk. But Celine didn't give him the chance to decide. She moved fast. Too fast. In one fluid motion, she struck Reese across the temple with the butt of the gun, knocking him out cold before pivoting and charging straight toward the driver. He tried to reach for his own weapon, but Celine was already inside his guard, already closing the distance. She slammed her elbow into his throat, his breath caught, his body convulsing, his balance shifting, and that's when she took his legs out. He hit the ground hard, choking on his own breath. The third man, the one who had been sitting shotgun, was too slow. Celine turned on him, her movements controlled, deliberate, closing the distance before he could draw his gun. She caught his wrist, twisted, sent his weapon skidding across the pavement. He swung at her, wild, desperate, but she ducked under it, shifting her weight, slamming her knee into his ribs with a force that sent him reeling back. The man groaned, clutching his side, trying to recover, but Celine wasn't interested in giving him that chance. She stepped forward, gripped his shirt, and drove him backward into the side of the car. His skull cracked against the frame, his body going slack. She let him slide to the pavement. The street was quiet. Only the sound of Reese's labored breathing, the faint scrape of shifting bodies, and the steady rhythm of Celine's own heartbeat filled the space between them. She turned back toward the sedan, took one step forward, and fired 2 shots into the windshield. The sound exploded through the street, shattering the quiet, sending people scrambling back into their homes, slamming doors shut, pulling curtains closed. A warning. A declaration. She took the money, stuffing it into her jacket, and disappeared into the night before they could gather the nerve to follow. The morning was unnaturally still, the weight of something wrong pressing against the air long before Selene stepped through the doors of Solace Clinic. It wasn't just the usual tension that clung to Ironwood like a disease. This was different. The moment she saw Dr. Corwin Henshaw's face, she knew. The doctor stood near the reception desk, his normally steady hands gripping the edge of the counter like it was the only thing keeping him upright. His broad shoulders, always squared with purpose, seemed heavier now, his usually stern expression replaced with something hollow, something restrained but crumbling at the edges. His eyes found hers, and the exhaustion, the quiet grief, cut deeper than words. Selene didn't ask. She didn't need to. They found him this morning. Henshaw's voice was quiet, stripped of everything but the raw weight of truth. Shot twice. In his chair, left outside his building like trash. Selene felt everything slow. The noise of the clinic, the murmurs of patients in the waiting room, the shuffle of feet, the ringing of a phone somewhere in the background, muffled beneath the roaring in her ears. The world pulled away, narrowing to something small and sharp, something ice-cold, settling deep in her bones. Henry Vargas. She had walked him home, had watched him roll inside, seen the tension in his shoulders ease ever so slightly after what had happened on the street. He had survived so much. Prison, paralysis, a life that had given him nothing but hard choices and harder consequences. And now he was gone. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. "This was tied," Henshaw said, his voice rough but steady. "It had to be. Of course it was." This was a message. Selene had made her move, and now they had made theirs. She inhaled, slow and steady, forcing the rage to stay buried beneath the surface, keeping her expression unreadable, even as her fingers twitched with the need to break something. "They want you to know this is your fault," Henshaw continued, his voice quieter now, but with a raw edge underneath. "They want you to know what happens when you push them." Selene's gaze flicked toward him, something dark passing through her eyes. "Good," she said. "Now I know what happens when they push me." Henshaw exhaled sharply, shaking his head, his frustration barely contained. "Selene!" But she was already moving. She turned on her heel, ignoring the way the clinic suddenly felt too small, too tight, the way her skin itched with the need to act. She didn't stop until she reached the back office, slamming the door shut behind her. She needed a plan. No, she needed to hit them back. Harder, smarter. This wasn't about retaliation anymore. This was war. Selene found Brick Calloway exactly where she expected, holed up in his usual corner at the Ironwood Club, drinking whiskey like the world hadn't just shifted. He must have seen her coming because he didn't look surprised when she yanked him from his seat and dragged him toward the back. "Jesus, Selene?" he started, but she slammed him against the brick wall near the emergency exit, her forearm pressing against his chest, keeping him pinned in place. "You're gonna tell me where the serpents get their guns," she said, her voice steady, cold. Brick let out a breath that was half a chuckle, half disbelief. "So this is how we're doing it." He winced as she pushed harder, his hands coming up in surrender. "Look, I get that you're pissed." Selene slammed her fist into his ribs, cutting off whatever excuse he had been about to make. Brick let out a sharp grunt, doubling over slightly, but she didn't let him collapse. She grabbed him by the front of his shirt and shoved him back against the wall. "You think this is about being pissed?" she said, her voice dangerously quiet. Brick coughed, shaking his head. "I swear to God, you're the craziest nurse I've ever met." Selene dug her knee into his gut, just enough to make him wheeze. "I don't have time for this, Brick. The serpents just killed a man I swore to protect. And if you make me ask again, you're going to be the next one gasping for breath." Brick's jaw clenched, his mind racing, weighing his options. Selene had seen that look before. Calculations, survival instincts kicking in, figuring out whether he could spin a lie fast enough to walk out of here in one piece. She wasn't in the mood to play that game. She leaned in close, her voice like a whisper of a blade against skin. "Tell me what I need to know," she murmured. "Or I start breaking fingers." Brick froze. She saw it. The flicker of real fear behind his eyes, the moment he realized she wasn't bluffing. He licked his lips, exhaled sharply, then muttered, "Kessler." Celine's grip didn't loosen. "Speak up." "Roland Kessler," Brick said louder, his voice tight. "Arms dealer out of North Point. He doesn't deal direct, moves everything through Dock 17. Shipments coming in tomorrow night. Low profile, big load." Celine held his gaze for a beat longer, making sure he wasn't feeding her a half-truth. Then, just as quickly as she had grabbed him, she let go. Brick staggered forward, coughing, rubbing his ribs. "You're out of your damn mind," he muttered. Celine adjusted her jacket. "No," she said, turning toward the door. "I'm just getting started." Celine had expected some kind of response after Brick gave up the location of the arms shipment. She had expected retaliation, expected threats, expected some poor bastard to try and prove a point by ambushing her in the street. What she hadn't expected was for the thorn serpents to be ahead of her at every turn. The weapons shipment never arrived. The docks had been empty when she got there. Nothing but the cold wind rolling off the water, the distant hum of cargo ships, and the gnawing feeling in her gut that told her she had been played. Either Brick had given her bad information, or the serpents had known she was coming. And given the way Brick's body was found the next morning, his fingers snapped at unnatural angles, his face caved in from repeated blows, left to rot in a back alley like disposable waste, it was clear that Red Mercer wasn't just cleaning up loose ends. He was sending a message. Celine had been expecting to move undetected, but Red had been watching her all along. The call came not long after Brick's body turned up. A number she didn't recognize flashing across her screen, the kind of silence on the other end that told her the person waiting to speak wasn't in any hurry, that he was letting the weight of anticipation do most of the work. She didn't say anything, didn't need to, because when the voice finally came, low and deliberate, carrying none of the false bravado or empty threats most men in this city relied on, she knew exactly who it was. "You're making a mess," Red Mercer said, his tone almost casual, as if he was discussing an inconvenience rather than a direct assault on his empire. "And I don't like messes." Celine didn't respond, her fingers tightening around the phone, her body still, her breathing steady, the quiet hum of the city around her almost distant as her focus narrowed on every single syllable he spoke. "There's no need for this to get worse," he continued, each word carefully measured, lacking the desperation or aggression of his underlings, just the calm certainty of a man who knew he always got what he wanted. "You're not an idiot, Celine. You know how this ends. We talk. We settle this. You stop interfering in things that don't concern you. And in return, no more bodies on your doorstep." Celine let the silence stretch, knowing he was waiting for her to bite, waiting for her to reach for the false truce he was offering, waiting for her to see sense and recognize that there was only ever one way this kind of fight ended. But the problem was, Red Mercer didn't offer peace. He offered compliance, and that wasn't the same thing. Celine exhaled slowly, forcing her voice to remain even, controlled. "I think we both know that's not going to happen." There was a slight pause on the other end, then a quiet hum, as if he had already expected that answer, but had hoped she would be smarter than this, that she would take the out he was handing her, that she would do what everyone else in this city had done and accept the fact that Ironwood belonged to him. "That's disappointing," he said, his voice still lacking any real emotion, but not unexpected. Then the line went dead. Celine stared at the phone for a long moment, her pulse steady, but her instincts screaming, because if Red had gone out of his way to call her himself, if he had stepped down from his throne just long enough to acknowledge her existence, then she knew something was already in motion. When Detective Callum Dorn stormed into the clinic an hour later, his expression lined with frustration, his jaw tight with the kind of anger that only came from trying and failing to stop someone from walking straight into their own destruction. She knew exactly what he was going to say before he even opened his mouth. "You think I don't know what you're doing?" he asked, stepping into her office without waiting for an invitation, his voice low, sharp, cutting through the air between them like a warning shot. Celine barely glanced up from the stack of patient files she wasn't really reading, her mind already elsewhere, already calculating the next step. "I don't have time for this, Dorn." "You don't have time?" He let out a short, humorless laugh, dragging a hand through his already disheveled hair, his frustration so tangible she could almost feel it pulsing off of him. "Celine, they are going to kill you." She didn't flinch. "They've tried." Dorn stepped closer, planting his hands against her desk, leaning into the space between them, his voice dropping lower, quieter, his tone not angry anymore, just raw, just desperate, just a man who knew he was watching someone dig their own grave and had no way to stop them. "You're not just a problem anymore, Celine. You're a liability. And Red Mercer? He doesn't let liabilities live." She met his gaze, something unreadable passing between them, something tangled in history and regret, and all the things they never said out loud. "You want me to stop?" she asked. "I want you to survive," he shot back. Celine held his stare, her heartbeat steady, her resolve unwavering, because she had never been the kind of person who knew how to walk away, had never been the kind of woman who let threats dictate her actions, had never let the inevitability of violence scare her into submission. "Then get out of my way." Dorn exhaled sharply, his lips pressing into a thin line, his fingers tightening against the wood of her desk. But he didn't argue, because they had already had this conversation before, because they had always had this conversation, because he knew there was nothing in this world that was going to make her back down. So he turned and walked out, without another word. The first thing Celine noticed was the smoke. She had been heading home, walking the familiar streets, her thoughts tangled in the weight of the battle she was fighting, in the pieces of a war that was rapidly slipping out of her control, in the cost that was already stacking higher than she had ever intended. And then she saw it, a thick column of black smoke rising into the sky, twisting against the backdrop of Ironwood's skyline, curling into the air like a death knell. Her pulse lurched before her brain even processed what she was seeing. Then came the sirens. Then the screaming. She ran, her breath burned in her throat, her ribs still aching from the last fight, but she didn't stop. Couldn't stop, refused to stop, even as the heat of the fire licked against her skin, even as she shoved through the growing crowd, even as the sickening crackle of burning wood filled her ears, even as she saw the only home these people had ever known crumble to ash before her eyes. Mrs. Holloway, Jacob Fenn, Miguel Ortiz, her patients, gone. And there, spray-painted across the sidewalk, glaring back at her like a brand burned into the pavement, was the emblem of the thorn serpents, a serpent coiled around a dagger, a signature, a claim, a declaration of war. Celine didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe, didn't feel anything but the cold certainty settling into her bones, the kind of certainty that no longer held space for anger or grief, the kind of certainty that stripped everything else away and left only one simple, undeniable truth. This wasn't about revenge anymore, because revenge implied there was still something to balance, but there was nothing left to even the scales. This was war, and she wasn't going to stop until every last one of them burned for what they had done. Celine had been prepared for retaliation, had braced herself for it the moment she walked away from the burning wreckage of the apartment complex, with smoke clinging to her skin and the screams of the dying still ringing in her ears. She had expected them to send men after her, to try and corner her in the streets, to make their move in the places where she had once felt safe. But she hadn't expected them to come with the kind of full-force execution that left no room for survival. She had been leaving the back entrance of a supply warehouse near the docks when the first shot rang out, the sharp crack of suppressed gunfire splitting the air a split second before she felt the white-hot bite of the bullet tearing into her side. The force of it sent her stumbling forward, her shoulder slamming into the rusted metal of a storage container, her breath catching in her throat as pain flared through her ribs, sharp and relentless. She barely had time to register the hit before the second shot grazed her arm, slicing through skin but missing bone. She didn't stop to think. She moved. Instinct took over, honed by years of knowing what it felt like to be hunted, of knowing the difference between cover and concealment, of knowing exactly how much time she had before the men coming for her closed the distance and made sure she didn't get back up. Her boots kicked up gravel as she darted between shipping crates, weaving through the maze of metal containers, pressing a hand against the wound in her side to slow the steady flow of blood soaking into her clothes. She counted at least 3 of them, maybe 4, moving fast, closing in, their footsteps crisp against the pavement, their voices low but urgent as they tried to box her in. They weren't here to send a message. They were here to kill her. Celine took a sharp turn, ducking into the narrow space between 2 stacked pallets, her breath shallow as she forced herself to keep moving, ignoring the fire blooming in her ribs with every step. She needed an exit. The serpents knew this area, knew the choke points, knew exactly where she was trying to go, and she couldn't let them steer her toward a dead end. She spotted an opening, a rusted fence leading into an adjacent scrapyard, a gap just wide enough to squeeze through if she was fast enough. But fast wasn't the problem. She could hear them now, the closest one less than 10 feet behind her, gun raised, ready to finish what they started. Celine turned at the last second, dropping low, twisting her body, using the momentum of her own movement to drive her elbow into the nearest man's throat. As he lunged forward, he choked, staggered, but before he could recover, she grabbed the barrel of his gun, forcing it sideways, yanking him into her knee. The gun went off, the shot wild, ricocheting off the metal container beside them. The others heard. She didn't wait, didn't have time. With a final shove, she sent the man crashing into the crate and took off, pushing through the fence, barely squeezing through the gap before the next shot tore through the chain link just inches from her head. She hit the ground hard on the other side, rolling over sharp gravel. Her vision blurred for half a second before she pushed herself up, ignoring the deep, splitting pain blooming in her ribs. A fracture, maybe worse, but she couldn't think about that now. She ran. By the time she reached the back alley behind an abandoned auto shop, the gunfire had stopped. Either they had lost her, or they were regrouping, deciding whether it was worth following the trail of blood she was leaving behind. She knew she couldn't risk leading them back to her apartment, couldn't go to the clinic, couldn't afford to be seen limping through the streets like an easy target. She needed to disappear. The safe house wasn't much, a storage unit on the south side of Ironwood, tucked between a condemned motel and a row of forgotten warehouses. It was barely big enough to move in, but it had supplies, weapons, enough medical gear to keep herself alive. She had stocked it for emergencies, and right now she was bleeding out on the floor, so it didn't get more urgent than this. Celine gritted her teeth as she pulled the blood-soaked fabric of her shirt away from the wound, fingers trembling slightly as she pressed gauze against it, forcing herself to stay upright, forcing herself to think beyond the pain, beyond the way her fractured rib was grinding every time she took a breath. She had underestimated them. She had thought she was dictating the pace of this war, had believed she could dismantle them piece by piece. But Red Mercer had been ahead of her the entire time. He had let her think she was winning, let her play soldier while he lined up the execution. That wouldn't happen again. Detective Callum Dorn had spent the last week chasing dead ends, trying to make sense of the sudden chaos unfolding in the streets. But the moment he saw the body count shifting, the moment he connected every attack, every broken operation, every retaliatory strike, he knew exactly what was happening. The thorn serpents weren't at war with another gang. They were at war with one person, Celine. The realization hit him like a punch to the ribs, a truth he had been avoiding, refusing to believe, because it didn't make sense, because it shouldn't have made sense. A single person wasn't supposed to be able to dismantle an operation like this, wasn't supposed to have the resources, the skill, the sheer willpower to turn an entire criminal empire on its head. But Celine wasn't just anyone. She had left bodies in her wake before, had fought in places where power shifted overnight, where survival belonged to those who could think 3 steps ahead and never hesitate. She had walked away from that life, had built something different, something better, something that wasn't soaked in blood and regret, until now, until she decided that no one else was going to fight this war, until she became the war. Dorn exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face, his mind racing, because if he could see it, so could Red Mercer. And that meant she was running out of time. Celine had been trying to outmaneuver Red Mercer, but now she could see the truth. She had never been playing the same game. Every move she made, every strike against the serpents, every attempt to cut their power at the roots had been expected, accounted for, and redirected like she was fighting an enemy that had already won before she even knew the battle had begun. She had thought Red was a crime boss, a gang leader who had taken control of Ironwood with sheer brutality and strategy. But she had been wrong. Red Mercer wasn't just protecting his operation. He was covering for someone else. The first sign came when the Solace Clinic was shut down. It wasn't the firebombs, the vandalism, or the intimidation tactics that had nearly run them into the ground before. This time, it was the law, a city order, citing code violations that had never existed, licensing issues that were fabrications, health infractions that had no basis in reality. An official document, signed by people who didn't want their names attached to it, delivered by a city official who wouldn't meet her eyes as he handed over the notice, as if he already knew that this was an execution rather than a procedural action. Celine had fought against criminals, against warlords, against men who believed they were gods because no one had ever told them otherwise. But this was something different. This wasn't just about money, power, or territory. This was systemic. This was political. And Red Mercer had never been the top of the food chain. He was just the enforcer, the blade in someone else's hand, the shield protecting the people who couldn't afford to get their hands dirty. When she tried to push back, the city pushed harder. The clinic's funding was frozen, its permits revoked, its medical suppliers suddenly unwilling to do business with them. Patients were turned away at the door. Desperate people with nowhere else to go left, standing on the sidewalk as the staff inside scrambled to salvage what they could. But it was over. The moment the doors locked, the moment the sign was taken down, the moment the last box of medical supplies was removed, Solace Clinic ceased to exist. Dr. Corwin Henshaw had seen enough. He had stuck it out through the firebombing, through the vandalism, through the threats that had been scrawled across the walls in red paint, through the late nights spent wondering when the serpents would decide that breaking the clinic wasn't enough. But this wasn't a fight he could win, and he knew it. When he walked into Seleni's office for the last time, his hands were already shaking. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice quiet, final, his eyes heavy with something close to guilt, but not regret. I thought if we just held out long enough, if we just pushed through, things would get better. But it's never going to get better, Selene. They're going to keep coming until there's nothing left. I need to get out before that happens to me. Selene didn't argue. She didn't tell him to stay, didn't try to convince him that they still had a chance, didn't tell him that walking away meant losing something more than just a job. Because Henshaw was right. The war had taken everything from her. Her home, her safety, her clinic, her patients, and now, the only people who had still been standing at her side. She was alone, and Red Mercer, had made sure of it. Celine had never wanted to ask for help. She had spent years surviving by relying only on herself, trusting no one but the instincts that had kept her alive in war zones. But she knew she couldn't take on the entire Thorn Serpents alone. Not now. Not with Red Mercer's reach stretching beyond the streets, beyond the gang, beyond what she had originally thought was just a criminal enterprise, and had now revealed itself to be something much deeper. The city had turned on her. The clinic was gone. Her allies had walked away, not out of cowardice, but out of the cold, calculated understanding that this fight was no longer about one gang terrorizing a neighborhood. This was something systemic, something built into Ironwood's foundation, something that couldn't just be burned away in the streets. And so, she found herself outside Detective Callum Dorn's apartment, pressing the buzzer once, then twice, knowing he was home, knowing he was probably standing on the other side of the door, deciding whether or not to let her in. When the lock finally clicked, she pushed her way inside before he could change his mind. Dorn looked like he hadn't slept in days. His shirt was wrinkled, his holster still strapped over his shoulder, like he had just gotten back from a case he hadn't solved. The smell of whiskey faint, but present enough to tell her exactly how he had been dealing with the stress. "You don't look happy to see me," Celine said, closing the door behind her. Dorn exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face before shaking his head. "Because I'm not." She ignored the remark, stepping further into the small, dimly lit apartment. "I need your help." Dorn let out a short, humorless laugh, rubbing at his temple. "Of course you do. I know Red Mercer isn't just running a gang. I know he's working with someone higher up, someone with real power." She kept her voice even, controlled. "And I know you've already figured that out, too." Dorn stared at her, his jaw tight, his shoulders tense. He didn't confirm it, but he didn't deny it either. Celine took another step forward. "If we take him out, we expose everything. Whatever corrupt deal he's protecting, whoever he's answering to, it all falls apart." Dorn let out a breath, shaking his head. "And what do you think happens after that, Celine? You think you just take out Mercer and the whole system crumbles? That the city suddenly wakes up and stops being the broken machine it's been for decades?" His voice was tired, bitter, the voice of a man who had spent years trying to clean one street in a city that would never stop bleeding. Celine didn't waver. "I think if I do nothing, people keep dying." Dorn sighed, stepping past her toward the kitchen, pulling a bottle from the counter and pouring himself a drink. "I can't help you," he said finally, his voice quieter now, edged with something almost regretful. Selina didn't blink. "Won't or can't?" Dorn swallowed, setting the glass down, gripping the edge of the counter like he needed something to steady himself. "Both." She studied him for a long moment, something unreadable passing between them, something tangled in old history, in unspoken words, in the weight of knowing they had always been on opposite sides of the same war. She turned, walking toward the door, her footsteps slow, deliberate. "If you won't stop them, I will." Dorn didn't respond, didn't try to argue, didn't tell her she was making a mistake, because he already knew she wasn't going to stop. She was done waiting. Celine knew that the only way to take control of this war was to dictate the next move. The Serpents were getting bolder, acting like they had already won, like their power in Ironwood was absolute, but she knew something they didn't. Red Mercer was starting to crack. She had seen it in the way his enforcers moved, the way they scrambled to regain their grip on the city after the failed hit on her, the way their intimidation tactics had started to feel desperate instead of calculated. He was losing control, and the moment men like him started to lose control, they got sloppy. She planned her ambush carefully, choosing an old textile warehouse on the south side of Ironwood, a place that had long since been abandoned, filled with rusting machinery, stacks of forgotten crates, a maze of steel beams and broken walkways that gave her the advantage. She made sure the Serpents knew she would be there. Word spread fast in the right circles. A whisper here, a loose conversation there, an invitation for Tide Bragg, Red's right-hand man, his enforcer, his attack dog, to come and finish what they had started. They took the bait. The serpents arrived in force, expecting to put her down once and for all. They had no idea they were walking into a kill box. The fight erupted the moment the first serpent stepped inside. Gunfire cracked through the air, the flashes of muzzle fire cutting through the dim light, as Selene moved through the shadows like a ghost, taking them apart, one by one, striking before they could react, cutting through their numbers with brutal efficiency. Bodies hit the concrete as the warehouse filled with chaos. She used the narrow walkways to her advantage, keeping herself out of their line of sight, moving fast, never staying in one place long enough for them to pin her down. She was outnumbered, but she had planned for that, had set up the environment to work in her favor, had turned their numbers against them by forcing them into tight spaces, where their guns became liabilities instead of strengths. Then, Tide Bragg stepped into the fray. The moment he saw her, he didn't hesitate. He moved like a battering ram, charging through the chaos, unbothered by the bullets, by the bodies, by the war raging around them, his only focus on her. Selene barely had time to dodge before his fist came swinging, a punch that could have shattered her jaw if it had landed. She ducked, pivoted, sent a quick strike into his side, but he barely reacted. Too big, too strong, too conditioned to pain for it to slow him down. He swung again. She moved, fast, but not fast enough. His elbow clipped her ribs, sending a sharp, burning pain through her already fractured bones. The force of it knocked her off balance, and before she could recover, he was on her, grabbing her by the jacket and launching her across the warehouse like she weighed nothing. She crashed into a stack of wooden crates, splinters cutting into her skin, her lungs struggling to pull in air as she hit the ground hard. Tide didn't give her time to recover. He was already closing in, already lifting his boot to crush her skull beneath his weight. Selene rolled at the last second, the stomp missing by inches, sending a jarring vibration through the ground as his foot connected with the concrete instead. She had to get up, had to move, had to turn the tide before he overwhelmed her completely. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. Tide Bragg was a wrecking ball, the kind of fighter who didn't need finesse, who had never needed to outthink an opponent because his size and raw strength had always been enough to end a fight before it ever truly started. He moved like a battering ram, every step carrying the force of someone who had never been told no, who had spent his life tearing through anyone who got in his way, who had built his reputation not on precision, but on the sheer unrelenting brutality of a man who knew no one could match his power. And right now, all of that power was focused entirely on breaking Selene. She could feel it in every strike, every movement, every swing of his fists, the way he threw his entire weight behind his attacks, how he barely cared about defense because he had never needed it before. His confidence wasn't misplaced. It was earned, carved from years of knowing that when he hit something, it stayed down. But Selene wasn't like the others he had fought. She wasn't built on brawn, wasn't designed to withstand brute force and trade blows until someone fell. She fought to win, not to prove herself. She knew that if she let him dictate the fight, if she let him control the rhythm, if she let him trap her in his game, then this would end like all of his fights did, with him standing over her body, unscathed, victorious. But Selene had spent too many years in war zones, too many years facing men who had thought the exact same thing, and she had learned a long time ago that there was no such thing as an invincible fighter. Everyone had weaknesses. You just had to know where to look. She sidestepped as Tide came barreling toward her again, dodging at the last possible second, making him commit to his own momentum, making him expend his energy in wild swings that carried all the power in the world, but no precision. He was trying to break her with sheer force, trying to make her feel small, but she wasn't going to let him. She moved with purpose, striking where it mattered, landing sharp, punishing blows to his ribs, his throat, the inside of his knee, anywhere that would weaken his stance and force him to rely on something other than raw strength. but Tide was fast for his size. Faster than she had expected. She barely had time to pivot before his arm lashed out, catching her mid-step, gripping the front of her jacket, and yanking her forward with enough force to pull her off her feet. She twisted in the air, trying to break free, but he had already shifted his weight, already turning, already using the momentum to lift her off the ground completely, before slamming her down onto the concrete with enough force to shake the floor beneath them. Pain exploded through her back, her ribs, her skull. She barely managed to roll away before his boot came crashing down where her head had just been, the impact cracking the concrete, sending dust into the air as he growled in frustration. Celine forced herself onto her feet, ignoring the sharp, radiating pain searing through her side, ignoring the way her vision blurred for half a second before she forced it back into focus. She needed to slow him down. It cracked his neck, rolling his shoulders, breathing just a little harder than before. But his confidence hadn't wavered. He could feel the damage she had done, but it hadn't been enough. Not yet. He wasn't afraid of her. That was about to change. Celine shifted her stance, adjusting her footing, calculating. She waited for the next charge, for the next attack, for the opening she knew would come, because no matter how strong Tide was, he was still human. And humans made mistakes. He lunged again, swinging wide, predictable, telegraphing his next move in the way all brawlers did when they started getting frustrated. She ducked low, closing the distance, stepping inside his guard before he could react, before he could adjust, before he could bring all that force to bear on her again. And then she struck with precision. She drove a palm straight into his throat, collapsing his airway just enough to make him stumble. She followed up immediately, using his brief disorientation to step behind him, twisting his arm at an unnatural angle, pulling it back just enough to send sharp pain shooting through his shoulder, just enough to make him feel it, just enough to let him know that she wasn't just fighting for survival. She was taking him apart, piece by piece. Tide roared, twisting violently, using brute force to break free, swinging at her the moment he got loose, a wild, reckless backhand that connected before she could fully dodge. The impact sent her reeling, her jaw snapping to the side, the taste of blood filling her mouth as she stumbled back, barely keeping her footing. She wiped the blood from her lips, tilting her head slightly, watching him, assessing. Tide was strong. But he wasn't invincible, and he had just realized that. Celine let a slow, measured smile creep onto her face as she squared up again, watching him, waiting, knowing that this fight wasn't over, but also knowing that she had just shifted it in her favor. Tide swung wide, putting his full weight behind the strike. But Celine had already moved. She slipped under his arm, pivoting inside his reach, closing the distance before he could reset. Her knee drove into his ribs, the same side she had targeted before. And this time, he felt it. His body lurched, his stance faltering for just a second. That was all she needed. She caught his arm, twisted it violently, forcing his shoulder out of position, and before he could break free, she struck again. An elbow to the base of his skull. Fast and precise. Tide staggered, his legs buckling for the first time, and Celine didn't stop. She grabbed his head, wrenched it down, and drove her knee into his face, breaking his nose, the impact sending a sharp snap through the air. Blood splattered against the concrete. Tide groaned, his body instinctively recoiling, his weight shifting just enough to expose the opening she needed. Celine seized the moment, grabbing the back of his head, twisting with brutal efficiency. The sharp crack of his neck breaking echoed through the warehouse. His massive body sagged, then collapsed to the ground. Lifeless, she stood over him, breathing hard, blood dripping from her knuckles, her ribs screaming with pain. But she didn't stop to recover. She had one more fight left. Red Mercer was waiting. She turned, her boots silent against the concrete as she moved toward the warehouse office, where the real war would be decided. The door was already open. Inside, Red Mercer sat behind a heavy wooden desk, a half-poured glass of whiskey in front of him, watching her with the calm indifference of a man who had seen this ending long before it had begun. His suit was pressed, his hands steady, his demeanor unchanged. This wasn't a man who fought with his fists. It was a man who fought with power. "I'd offer you a drink," Mercer said, tilting the glass slightly, the ice clinking against the sides. "But something tells me you're not in the mood." Celine didn't move, her breathing slow, controlled, her muscles still coiled from the fight. Mercer studied her, nodding slightly, as if assessing a final piece of a puzzle. "You've made a hell of a mess, I'll give you that. Cost me good men, money, a city that was running just fine until you decided to play hero." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "But you've proven your point. You want the serpents gone? Fine. They'll back off. You want Ironwood to heal? I can make that happen. All you have to do is walk away." Celine stared at him, silent. "This city doesn't change," Mercer continued. "You know that better than anyone. Take your win, Celine. Leave while you still can." She stepped forward, her eyes never leaving his. "You think I did all this just to walk away?" Mercer exhaled slowly, shaking his head, almost disappointed. "I think you did all this because you don't know how to do anything else." Celine's fingers flexed at her sides. Mercer reached into a drawer, pulled out a sleek silver pistol, and set it on the desk between them. He didn't point it at her. He didn't need to. "This is where it ends," he said, his voice calm, "one way or another." Celine didn't move immediately. She stood across from Red Mercer, her body still aching from the fight with Tide, her breath measured, her focus absolute. Mercer wasn't like his men. He didn't rely on brute strength, didn't throw himself into fights without calculation. He was the kind of man who only fought when there was no other option. And if he had reached for a gun instead of calling in more of his men, it meant he saw her as the last problem he had to solve himself. The silver pistol sat on the desk between them, untouched. A single moment, a single movement would decide whether this ended with a bullet or with something far worse. Mercer exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders, flexing his hands like he was shaking off tension. But Celine didn't miss the way his fingers curled slightly, the way his stance adjusted just enough to be ready to lunge. She had seen this before, the quiet before the explosion. "You really think this is how it ends?" Mercer asked, his voice still smooth, still calm, like he was trying to decide if he was impressed or just irritated. "You took out Tide, burned half my operations, made enough enemies to last 10 lifetimes. And for what? To prove you could? You know what happens after this, right? You think the people you saved will remember you? They'll just move on to the next thing. They always do." Celine didn't answer. Mercer leaned forward, resting his palms against the desk. "You could still walk out of here." Celine's eyes flicked to the gun between them, then back to him. "You really want to bet on that?" For the first time, Red Mercer smiled. Then he moved. His hand shot for the pistol, but Celine was faster, kicking the desk forward, slamming it into his midsection, knocking him off balance just long enough for her to lunge across the space. She went for his wrist, for control of the gun, but Mercer twisted, using her own momentum against her, slamming his forearm into her side before she could fully lock him down. The gun clattered to the floor. They both ignored it. This wasn't going to end with a bullet. This was going to end with blood. Mercer came at her fast, a blur of precise, calculated strikes, and Celine barely blocked the first elbow before he followed up with a sharp knee to her ribs, targeting the same spot Tide had weakened earlier. Pain flared through her side, but she didn't let it slow her down. She pivoted, ducking under his next attack, twisting inside his reach, driving her palm into his sternum to create space. Mercer didn't stumble. He caught her wrist, twisted sharply, forcing her to drop lower to avoid having her arm wrenched out of place. His grip was like iron, but Celine was faster. She dropped to one knee, using her entire body weight to throw him forward, breaking his hold and sending him stumbling just far enough for her to regain her footing. The moment he recovered, he reached for something at his side. A blade, sleek, military grade. The kind of knife meant for precise, lethal work. Celine didn't hesitate. She reached for her own. The air between them shifted. This wasn't a fight anymore. This was a death match. Mercer tested the weight of the knife in his hand, eyes locked onto her, calculating. "You could have been something more, you know," he mused. "You were smart enough? Skilled enough? Could have played the game instead of burning the whole board." Celine rolled her knife between her fingers, adjusting her grip. "And let men like you run the world? Not a chance." Mercer smirked. "Your loss." Then he attacked. Their blades clashed in a blur of steel and movement. Mercer moving with the precision of a man who had done this before. Celine meeting him strike for strike. He aimed for soft targets, tendons, arteries, places where a single deep cut could cripple or kill. But Celine saw his patterns, recognized his movements, countered them. She sidestepped his first slash, knocking his wrist just enough to divert the blade before aiming a sharp stab toward his ribs. He deflected it, his knife slicing just past her cheek, close enough for her to feel the sting of the edge. She countered immediately, stepping inside his guard, driving her knee into his thigh to throw off his balance, slashing at his forearm to weaken his grip. Mercer retaliated, twisting sharply, bringing the hilt of his knife against the side of her head in a punishing blow that sent her vision flashing white for half a second. Celine staggered but recovered fast, stepping back, circling. They moved like two shadows locked in a deadly rhythm, each movement precise, each attack calculated, both of them bleeding now, small cuts and bruises already forming, but neither giving an inch. Mercer was good, better than most. But Celine had spent years fighting killers, not businessmen. And she wasn't about to lose to a man who had spent most of his life letting others fight for him. Mercer lunged again, trying to feint, trying to bait her into a mistake. Celine saw it. She didn't fall for it. Instead, she let him think she had misstepped, let him commit to the attack. Then she moved. She twisted inside his reach, trapping his wrist, slamming her knife deep into his shoulder, twisting the blade just enough to send a sharp burst of pain through his nerves, enough to weaken his dominant arm. Mercer snarled, but Celine wasn't finished. Before he could recover, she grabbed him by the collar and drove her forehead into his nose, shattering cartilage, sending blood spraying across the room. He stumbled, but he wasn't out yet. He wiped the blood from his face, breathing hard, his grip still tight on his blade. He was wounded, but he wasn't done. Neither was she. They circled each other again, bleeding, breathing hard, but neither willing to stop until the other was on the ground for good. Mercer still had the weight of experience, of knowing exactly how to kill without wasting a movement. But Celine had something stronger. She had spent years learning to adapt, to survive in places where men like him had set the rules, only to see them fall when they realized she wasn't playing by them. This was no longer about brute strength, no longer about domination. It was about breaking him down piece by piece until there was nothing left. Mercer lunged first, using the full weight of his body behind the strike, a fast, aggressive thrust aimed at her ribs. But Celine was already shifting, twisting at the last second, letting him overextend, his momentum working against him as she redirected his arm, forcing his knife downward instead of toward her body. Before he could recover, she struck, slamming her knee into his gut, feeling the impact vibrate up her leg as his body jerked from the force. He grunted, staggering back, but she didn't let him breathe, didn't let him adjust, didn't give him the moment he needed to reset his stance. She grabbed the nearest object, a heavy glass paperweight from the overturned desk, and swung it with everything she had, the solid weight colliding with his temple with a sickening crack. Mercer stumbled, his body reeling, but even as the pain registered, even as blood trickled down the side of his face, he gritted his teeth and retaliated, catching her with a brutal backhand that sent her crashing into the overturned chair. The impact sent a sharp flare of pain through her ribs, forcing her vision to blur for half a second, but she pushed through it, forced herself to keep moving. Mercer didn't wait. He advanced, knife flashing, his movements sharp, controlled, still dangerous despite the damage she had already done to him. Celine knew she had to end this now before exhaustion and injury gave him the upper hand. She ducked beneath the next slash, grabbed the broken remains of a desk lamp, and yanked the cord free, using it like a whip, snapping it across the back of his knife hand with precise force. The pain made his grip falter just enough for her to move in, seizing his wrist, twisting it in a sharp, brutal motion that forced him to drop the blade. He fought back, throwing his full weight into her, slamming her against the wall, his forearm pressing against her throat, cutting off air, pinning her with sheer force. Celine gasped, feeling the pressure against her windpipe, knowing she had seconds before she lost consciousness. But instead of trying to break his grip with strength, she used leverage, shifting her weight, slamming her knee into his thigh, striking the nerve cluster with pinpoint accuracy. His stance wavered for just a second, and that was all she needed. She grabbed the metal ruler from the nearby desk, snapped it forward like a blade, driving the sharpened edge into the inside of his elbow, cutting deep into the muscle. Mercer snarled in pain, his grip loosening just enough for her to shove him back, flipping them over in a controlled takedown, pinning him beneath her as they crashed against the shattered remnants of the glass divider. His body jerked against the debris, his strength fading as blood seeped from multiple wounds, his breath ragged beneath her weight. Celine snatched the fallen knife from the floor, gripping it tightly, pressing it against the side of his throat. His body was still tense, still resisting. But he wasn't fighting anymore. Not really. His chest rose and fell, his breath uneven, his jaw clenched. But there was something else in his expression now, something she had never seen in him before. Recognition. He knew this was it. Mercer swallowed hard, his voice hoarse, strained from the fight, from the pain, from everything leading to this moment. You want to do it? Finish it. You came all this way, fought this hard, just to stop now? His lips curled slightly, blood staining his teeth as he let out a breath that was half a chuckle, half a wince. You kill me, and nothing changes. Someone else steps in. Someone worse. This city doesn't heal, Celine. It just finds new devils. Her grip tightened around the handle of the knife, her pulse pounding, every muscle in her body screaming for her to end it. She had imagined this moment 100 times, had thought about what it would feel like to take away his power the way he had taken everything from her. But now, standing over him, knife in hand, it didn't feel like justice. It felt like the end of a cycle she had spent her whole life trying to escape. Killing him wouldn't bring back what he destroyed. It wouldn't fix the lives he had ruined. It wouldn't undo the war he had started. All it would do was turn her into what he had always believed she was. Celine exhaled sharply, the sound barely audible over the ringing in her ears, her fingers loosening just enough for the tension in her shoulders to drop. She lifted the knife away from his throat, still watching him, still feeling the heat of the rage burning inside her, but no longer letting it dictate what happened next. You don't get to decide what this city becomes, she said, her voice steady, controlled, stronger than she felt. And I don't need to kill you to win. Mercer's smirk faltered, the realization hitting him like a second blow. He had always believed that power was measured in violence, in control, in who walked away and who didn't. But Celine had already beaten him the moment she chose to be something else. She pushed herself off of him, stepping back, wiping the blood from her brow as she turned toward the door. Mercer groaned, struggling to sit up, knowing he had lost but too stubborn to admit it. You think walking away makes you better than me? Celine didn't stop, didn't turn back, didn't waste another breath on a man who no longer mattered. She had spent too long chasing revenge, too long trying to fight fire with fire, and now she was done. You don't get to matter anymore, she said simply, before walking out of the office and leaving Red Mercer behind, bleeding, broken, and alone. Celine stepped out of the warehouse, her breath still heavy, her body aching from the fight. but she didn't stop moving. The night air was thick with the scent of blood, sweat, and the faint trace of gasoline lingering from the earlier fight. The streets outside were eerily quiet, the usual hum of the city feeling distant, almost muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for what came next. She didn't have to wait long. Red and blue lights flickered against the walls of the alley, the sharp screech of tires breaking the silence as Detective Callum Dorn arrived, stepping out of his car, his face unreadable, but his gun already drawn. Celine didn't react as he approached, his eyes scanning her like he was trying to piece together what exactly had just happened. He looked past her, toward the warehouse, toward the broken glass, the overturned furniture, and finally, toward the bloodied, defeated man slumped against the floor inside. Red Mercer wasn't getting back up. Dorn exhaled, slow and measured, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly as he holstered his weapon, stepping closer but keeping his voice steady. "Tell me he's still breathing." Celine wiped the blood from her lip, barely sparing a glance over her shoulder. "He'll live." Dorn studied her for a long moment, then sighed, shaking his head before motioning to the officers behind him. "Cuff him." The officers moved past her without hesitation, stepping over the shattered remnants of the warehouse office, hauling Mercer up from the floor. He barely had the strength to stand, his body slumping under the weight of his own injuries. But he still had enough arrogance left in him to glare at Celine, his lip curled in something that might have once been a smirk. But now it was just a bitter, bloody twist of his mouth. "You think this means anything?" His voice was hoarse, rough from the fight, from the chokehold that had nearly ended him. "You think Ironwood changes just because I'm gone?" Dorn didn't give him the chance to say anything else. He pulled the cuffs from his belt and snapped them over Mercer's wrists with sharp efficiency, not bothering to be gentle. "You had your turn," he muttered, his voice edged with something close to satisfaction. "Now you get to rot." Mercer didn't struggle, didn't fight. He just let the officers drag him toward the squad car, his head lolling slightly to the side as they shoved him inside, slamming the door behind him. Celine watched as the car pulled away, disappearing around the corner, taking the man who had spent years choking the life out of this city with it. Dorn let out a breath, dragging a hand down his face before turning back to her. "You should be in cuffs, too," he said, though his voice lacked any real conviction. "You burned half the city coming after him." Celine wiped at the blood on her knuckles, flexing her fingers. "And?" Dorn let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "And I can't even bring myself to be mad about it." He glanced toward the warehouse, taking in the destruction, the wreckage of Mercer's last stand. "You did what I couldn't." She didn't respond. They both knew the truth. He had always known how to take Mercer down, but the law had never been enough. The system had protected him. The city had protected him, and by the time they had enough to move against him, it would have been too late. Celine hadn't waited, and now Ironwood was finally free. The serpents fell apart before the sun even rose. With Mercer gone, his lieutenants turned on each other, some scrambling to cut deals, others trying to claim what was left of his empire, but there was nothing left to take. Dorn made sure of it. His officers raided every safe house, every stash, every business that had once lined Mercer's pockets. Within days, the entire operation collapsed, the remains scattered, leaderless, meaningless. The people who had suffered under them for so long took back what was theirs. Every dollar stolen from Celine's patients, from the shop owners, from the working people who had been forced to pay for protection they never wanted, was returned. The victims, the ones who had spent their lives looking over their shoulders, finally had justice. The clinic reopened within the week, in the City officials, desperate to distance themselves from Mercer now that he was behind bars, erased every false violation, every charge, every obstacle that had been thrown in their way. Grants were restored, funding returned. Solace Clinic, the place Celine had fought so hard to protect, stood once more. Dr. Corwin Henshaw walked through the doors like he had never left, but when he saw Celine standing outside, something in his expression shifted. Relief, maybe, but also something else. Regret. "You coming in?" he asked, arms crossed, watching her carefully. She looked past him, through the glass doors, at the familiar walls, the waiting room that had once been hers, the people who had once been hers to protect. She had fought for this place, given everything for it, but now, standing here, she realized something. She wasn't sure if she belonged anymore. "Not today," she said. Henshaw didn't push, didn't try to convince her otherwise. He just nodded once, understanding. Doors always open. She turned away, stepping back into the city she had nearly burned down in her war against Mercer. But the fight wasn't over. The man who had protected Mercer, the one who had kept him in power, kept the city in his pocket, pulling the strings from behind the scenes, thought he had escaped. Councilman Gerald Lawton had spent years feeding ironwood to men like Mercer, covering up their crimes, making sure no one could touch them. He had built his career on power disguised as public service. Now, with Mercer gone, his name was the only one left standing. The files recovered from Mercer's offices were enough to bury him. Financial records, hidden transactions, backdoor deals with law enforcement, judges, campaign donors, all of it was exposed. Lawton was arrested before the week was out. His face was on every news channel, his voice caught on recordings as he made deals with criminals, as he sold out the very people he had been elected to serve. His career wasn't just over. It was erased. Ironwood had suffered under him for too long. Now, it was finally free. The city had changed, not in the way that happens overnight with headlines declaring a new dawn, but in the quiet, subtle way that could only be noticed by those who had lived through the worst of it. The streets that had once belonged to the Thorn Serpents carried a different energy now, no longer weighed down by the presence of men lurking on corners, waiting to collect their cut from terrified business owners. The constant, uneasy tension that had settled into the bones of Ironwood was gone, dissipated like smoke after a long burning fire. For years, fear had ruled these streets, shaping the way people moved, the way they spoke, the way they hesitated before stepping outside their own doors after dark. But now, with Mercer gone, with the serpents dismantled, with the corruption that had been holding the city hostage finally exposed, Ironwood was reclaiming itself. Businesses that had operated under duress, handing over their hard-earned profits just to keep from being targeted, had begun to thrive in a way they hadn't in years. Families that had once accepted violence as part of their daily reality could breathe again, could walk down the street without feeling like they were trespassing in a city that never truly belonged to them. At the heart of it all, Solace Clinic stood, repaired, rebuilt, and open once more. The walls had been repainted, every trace of the damage that had nearly destroyed it erased, leaving behind a space that was warm, welcoming, and, most importantly, safe. Patients filled the waiting room, not just the ones who had been coming here for years, but new faces too. People who had once been too afraid to seek help in a place that had been marked as a battleground in someone else's war. Now, they sat in the chairs, waiting for care, without the unspoken fear that someone might come crashing through the door, demanding payment, threatening consequences. Dr. Corwin Henshaw moved through the halls with a quiet, assured confidence, settling back into the work he had once feared was lost. He had spent too many nights believing that the clinic had been doomed, that there had been no way to fight back against the men who had made it their playground. But now, as he moved from patient to patient, as he checked charts, as he gave orders to the staff who had returned without hesitation, he knew that he had been wrong. Solace had survived, and it had survived because of her. Celine stood across the street, her hands tucked into her jacket, watching the steady rhythm of people moving in and out of the clinic, the quiet hum of life returning to something that felt almost normal. She had fought for this, for these people, for this place, had given everything she had to make sure it could still stand. And yet, now that it was here, now that the fight was truly over, she found herself unable to step through those doors. She had never done this for recognition. She had never done this to be thanked. Never done this for any personal gain. She had done it because no one else would, because the city had needed someone who didn't care about playing by the rules, someone who would do what had to be done, even if it meant crossing a line that could never be undone. She had done her part. That was enough. The door to the clinic swung open, and Henshaw stepped outside, immediately noticing her across the street. He hesitated for a second before crossing toward her, his expression careful, unreadable, though his presence alone said more than his words ever could. He stopped a few feet from her, glancing over his shoulder at the clinic before exhaling, letting the weight of everything settle between them. "It's different now," he said, his voice quieter than usual, more thoughtful. "No gangs, no threats, no more looking over our shoulders. We're finally free." He didn't respond right away, just kept watching the building, watching the people moving in and out. She had spent so long fighting that she wasn't sure if she knew how to exist without a war. "You did this," Henshaw continued, as if he had been waiting to say it, as if it had been sitting on his chest for too long. "I know you don't need to hear it, but you should." She exhaled slowly, the weight of his words settling into something deep inside her. She didn't need to hear it, didn't need anyone to tell her what she had accomplished, didn't need validation for what had always been an inevitability. But still, standing here now, looking at everything that had been restored, she felt something close to closure. Henshaw studied her for a moment longer, then nodded toward the clinic. "You coming in?" She looked at the doors, at the familiar halls beyond them, at the place that had once been her home, her reason for staying, for fighting, for standing when no one else would. And yet, despite everything, despite the victory, despite the knowledge that she had finally won, she knew the truth. She didn't belong here anymore. "Not today," she said, her voice steady, resolved. Henshaw didn't push, didn't try to change her mind. He just nodded, understanding in the way only someone who had been through war could. Doors always open. She gave him one last look before turning away, stepping back into the streets she had nearly burned down in her war against Mercer. But the fight was over. There was no war left to win, no enemies left to hunt. Ironwood would be fine without her. She had fought to save this place, but it didn't need her anymore. Maybe, for the first time in years, she could finally stop fighting. The road stretched ahead, endless and open, the kind of emptiness that invited people to start over. The city faded in her rearview mirror, its neon glow disappearing into the distance as she drove with no real destination in mind, just the quiet hum of the engine and the weight of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. She pulled off the highway after a few hours, finding herself in a town that had no name worth remembering, just a place with a gas station, a motel, and a quiet diner with flickering neon lights. She took a seat at the counter, ordered a coffee, and listened to the easy hum of conversation around her. No threats, no violence, no weight pressing down on her shoulders. The waitress poured her coffee, giving her a polite smile, and for the first time in years, Celine realized she wasn't looking for a fight. She wasn't watching the exits, wasn't reading the body language of the people around her, wasn't waiting for the next battle to come knocking at her door. She took a slow sip of coffee, let the moment settle, then leaned back in her seat, finally allowing herself to breathe. She wasn't a soldier anymore. She wasn't a warrior. She was just Celine. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.